So apparently I have a series on this channel now. Who would have thought? I go through the life of people that have existed whose lives I find interesting, essentially. Because the first episode was about Ernst Röhm, who was a bad guy, and the second episode was about Junipero Serra, who was an ambiguous guy. I thought to sort of round it out, I'd go for the third episode with a good guy. So I figured today I will talk about Bob Ross, who was basically a YouTuber before YouTube was even a thing. Robert Norman Ross was born in Daytona Beach, Florida on the 29th of October 1942. And yes, Bob Ross is indeed the only good thing to ever come out of Florida. Florida man with afro creates internationally successful television show on public access. You know, I don't really know about all the Florida thing. I don't believe in the Florida is bad thing. That's just something that all my Americans fan do, so I have to bandwagon so I can pretend like I understand what you're talking about, but I have no problem with Florida. Why is Florida so bad? You know how psychopaths tend to torture and kill animals when they're kids? Bob Ross did the exact opposite. He would find injured animals, get them home, nurture them back to health, and then release them into the wild. This included, but was not limited to, keeping a young alligator in his parents' bathtub. And he started doing this early in childhood, and he never stopped. You see, in his show, they sometimes have footage of animals that he takes at home, and sometimes even they have animals on the show, where they just sit on the easel and watch him paint. Like any successful person, Bob Ross dropped out of high school and tried to become a carpenter. That didn't last very long though, because he accidentally sawed off part of his left index finger. This is what it looked like forever, and also there is an animal that he had in this picture. When he was 18, he joined the Air Force, because, you know, the guy who is pretty much Buddha on Valium is really suited for that kind of career. He moved to Alaska and stayed with the army for a whopping 20 years before retiring as a master sergeant. Oh, and by the way, this was his job in the Air Force.
You little scumbag! I got your name! I got your ass! You will not laugh! You will not cry! You will learn by the numbers! I will teach you! Now get up! Get on your feet!
Yeah, he was a drill sergeant. Yelling mean words at people was his job, and apparently he wasn't terrible at it. And because he was a drill sergeant, when he did leave the army, he decided to never ever yell again in his life ever. And though that sounds a bit, you know, crazy, if there's one guy in history where I believe that he could have done that, it's Bob Ross. He married his first wife, Vivian Ridge, in 1965, and they had a son together called Steve. And then they divorced in 1977, which incidentally is also the year that he married his second wife, Jane Ross. Aside from his meager pension, Bob Ross took two things from his time in Alaska. The first was a love for painting, and the second was a love for the magnificent landscapes of the state. During his time in the military, he did get into painting over military courses, but he never liked the way that the instructors taught. That is until one fateful day he was working as a bartender somewhere and was watching the television, and the show that was on was The Magic of Oil Painting. That is how Bob Ross discovered the a la prima technique, or as Bill Alexander, the host of the show and later the mentor of Bob Ross, liked to call it, wet on wet. He was at this point still in the army, just to make this clear. He only retired from the armed forces when he thought he had financial independence. See, the problem with oil painting is that you can't really paint fast. When you have one layer of color on the canvas, you need to wait for it to dry, and that can take days, if not weeks. With the wet-on-wet technique, you just don't do that. You just paint new paint over still wet layers of already existing paint. And this is very difficult because where traditional oil painting requires patience and planning skill, wet-on-wet requires improvisation and speed. The way that the colors will spread over the underlying layers, and the way they will diffuse and the way they will go over the canvas can be a bit unpredictable, so you can't see those things as mistakes. You have to see them as happy little accidents. A la prima first rose to popularity in Flanders, which is the southern Netherlands and also the bit south of the Netherlands, in part in the mid-17th century. One of the great painters that used this technique at the time was Rembrandt. But then again, Rembrandt did sort of try everything. He would not be pinned down to a single technique or subject matter. Wet on Wet allows you to produce a painting in roughly 30 minutes. And after seeing Bill Alexander, who sort of revived this technique after it had fallen into a bit of obscurity, he went down to Florida and became the guy's pupil, and eventually traveled the country as an instructor working for Bill Alexander. Now, you would think that Bob Ross would eventually himself have the idea of doing a television show where he painted paintings, on account of a television show where people painted paintings being the show that inspired him to learn alla prima. Yeah, not so much. It required one of his students, Annette Kowalski, who would eventually become his producer, to pitch him not just the idea of the joy of painting, but of the painting accessories empire that accompanied it. And here's how we get into how Bob Ross is essentially the OG YouTuber. Bob Ross is most famous for and through the television series The Joy of Painting. But the thing is, he never got paid for that. And he also didn't sell the paintings he produced on the show. He was working for PBS, which is a non-profit organization that comprises a huge number of television stations all around the United States, and it's partly funded by the United States government and also by donations. PBS stations specialize in educational programming and programming that has particular artistic merit, as well as niche programming where you have, like, it's very pertinent to a certain group of people, but it wouldn't be financially feasible to do this on a commercial network, so PBS does it. Also, they serve as an alternative emergency broadcasting system for the US government. Bob Ross would paint 3 paintings for each episode of the show. One he would have as reference, it would be placed outside of the camera. He'd have his canvas here, and then he would paint and look at that one to see what he was doing. The thing is that they always looked very different from each other, because such is alla prima. Then there was also the third painting, which was painted after the fact, where someone would take pictures and it would go into like an instructional manual that was very in-depth for hardcore Bob Ross fans. And really, this is how he made his money. The PBS show was just a vehicle to get people to buy that merch. That merch obviously being his instructional books and the classes he taught all over America, and also colors that he sold. Buy that merch is also something you should do for my channel. I have some pretty fire merch, dab. All of the paintings produced on the show was sold to PBS stations all over America, some of which did sell them for, you know, donations to fund other programming. It took a while, but eventually he made a lot of money doing this. But in the meantime, he made some questionable choices. For one, he had like gold pans and he would paint Alaskan landscapes into them, and then he sold them? And like, why? He also got a perm, which is the afro that he has, because he was so poor at one point that he couldn't afford to go to the hair salon. This is what he looked like before he got that big beautiful ball of hair. It was an iconic hairstyle, really. Not as much of a mistake as a happy accident. The problem was that he could never ever change it. They were selling paint cans with this afro on it. It was part of the brand. Getting rid of it would have been like Joe Rogan getting rid of his muscles and becoming fat. Or Sam Elliott getting rid of his mustache. Okay, turns out he can actually pull that off somehow. Still. So yeah, Bob Ross was stuck with that hairstyle even though he eventually really didn't want it anymore. But probably at least in part because of it, The Joy of Painting was a huge international success. It ran from the 11th of January 1983 to the 17th of May 1994. And I need this paper because I literally cannot remember numbers. Also, the main theme of the show, which is a beautifully boring piece called Interlude, was created by Elvis Presley's first keyboardist. The only reason I'm telling you this is because when I was writing the script for this video, I was listening to that song. So if you've never seen an episode of The Joy of Painting, what the fuck? But also it goes like this. The episode would start with Bob Ross standing in this part of the frame with his palette, which was painted black to avoid reflections, and also pretty much always had the same colors on it. And here he would have the canvas, which was either covered in white or black foundational paint, so it was already wet and he could just start on painting, because it would have been pretty boring if he just put white or black paint on that canvas in the first place. And the thing why there were 2 different colors is because you achieve different effects depending on whether or not you use white or black. And then he would always invite the audience to paint with him and just sort of start painting, and give them wise words of wisdom and encouragement in life, and explaining what he did. And to be fair, not a lot of people did actually paint when the show was on. Bob Ross has a very nice voice, and he speaks in a very calming manner.
And let's begin thinking, pick up a little roll of paint right on the edge of the knife. Let's begin thinking of some land mass that lives back here, that all these little things they have to have a place to stay.
Even back in the day, people would just have Bob Ross on to calm down, feel good about themselves, and then fall asleep. And there is now science on the fact that when Bob Ross is on, people sleep better. This is also my personal relationship with this show. Because of things that have happened to me in the past, I will sometimes have phases where I just get night terrors all the time. And also I have insomnia, which is probably unrelated to that. But when Bob Ross is on, I can't even get through a half-hour episode before I sleep like a log and without any nightmares. It's fucking great. Also, ASMR people like him a lot, but I don't get the ASMR tingles, so I can't attest to that. Bob Ross was just so nice and loving and relaxing, and genuinely so. Everybody loved him, not just in the US, but around the world. He was big in Japan, and really still is. And the thing is, he never expected any of that. He expected his show to be like an obscure little thing that was on some university station in Muncie, Indiana, and that was that. But the whole world tuned in. He would spend a lot of time training a la prima instructors who would then travel all around the world to teach the technique. He spent most of his time in Florida, where he lived, which is like the opposite end of the US from the place where he loved the landscapes of, and not a lot is known about his personal life because he was an extremely private person with a very, very small and tight-knit circle of friends. And even the Bob Ross Inc., the company that still exists even though he doesn't, was very, very protective and continues to be very, very protective of anyone divulging any kind of personal information about him. And frankly, it seems like it was just a life that wasn't particularly eventful outside of the painting thing. All we know is that he spent a lot of time nursing animals back to health. That's basically it. And when he wasn't touring occasionally, he would go up to Muncie and tape a new season of The Joy of Painting, which he could do in 2 days. I mean, it's not like the show has the greatest production value, but it's still impressive. One person who really did not like anything about Bob Ross and his newfound fame and his success and the success of the media empire that sprawled around him was his old mentor, Bill Alexander. Though he did appear in one of the earlier seasons of the show as a guest painter, which sometimes happened, and also Bob Ross essentially dedicated the whole show to him. In the very first episode he goes, "This is a technique that my friend Bill taught me." He became ultra jealous of his former student's success. Apparently, he felt like Bob Ross had somehow betrayed him by sort of stealing the skills that he paid money to learn and then becoming ultra rich from it, which Bob Ross was never extremely wealthy, even though his company did make a lot of money. But Alexander went so far as to claim that he invented the wet-on-wet painting technique, which isn't true unless he is a vampire who lived in mid-17th century Flanders. Speaking of guests, Bob Ross had them, they were on the show, and one of them was my absolute favorite, and that's his son Steve. Steve Ross is also a very good painter and was on the show several times, and my favorite time was in episode 11 of season 31, where he just sort of loaded the entire episode full of innuendos and double entendres.
Pound it into that brush real good. Get tough with it right from the beginning. Be real rough on it. You're not going to hurt that canvas. It's a really good idea to have a sturdy easel like this one. Just go up there and pull down real gently. Just lay some snow in there. Just like that. Push it into the paint. Pull through like this, real long and flat strokes. Nice big one. There we go. All the way down to the bottom. Just smash right over the bottom of that tree and put some bushes in there. You could do that part with a paint roller and get away with it.
What an amazing man. He broke with Bob Ross Inc. after his father died and is no longer affiliated with the company for undisclosed reasons. In 1992, something terrible happened in the love-filled and happy life of Bob Ross. His wife, Jane, died of cancer. And you can tell if you watch episodes from that time, this was tough for Bob. I mean, obviously his wife of many years, the woman that he loved, had just died. But he was still sort of happy painting. He still gave people happiness painting and relaxation, because painting was always the thing that had made him happy. But if you watch those, man, it is fucking sad. He always wished his viewers the best and he tried to make their day, but he was a fucking wreck.
There we are. You know, it's like in life. You gotta have a little sadness once in a while so you know when the good times come. I'm waiting on the good times now.
Eventually, you know, things got better. The good times did sort of come back a little bit, until the show abruptly ended in 1994. Nobody knew why, and there was wild speculation at the time. I'm realizing now that I was probably conceived around the time when the show ended, and my mother was a huge Bob Ross fan. Reruns started almost immediately. The guy was an institution. His show couldn't just stop. What would all the people fall asleep to? And also, his company still did continue selling stuff. In 1995, he married Linda Brown. 2 months later, he was dead. The thing that happened in early 1994 was that he was diagnosed with lymphoma, which is a type of cancer of white blood cells. And then he passed away aged only 52. The thing is, nobody actually knew about this until after his death. Because Bob Ross was so private, it wasn't disclosed that he was even sick before he died. There's this old wisdom, people say, oh, good things happen to good people. And if you look at Bob Ross, you realize that that's just not true. He was just one of the nicest, most genuine persons to ever walk the face of the earth. He gave love and encouragement and good blessed sleep to millions of people around the world. Every celebrity has skeletons in their closet, but even after 20 years of trying to find something in Bob Ross's life that might constitute a skeleton in his closet, we have found nothing. Aside from Bill Alexander being salty as fuck, and a lot of atelier-dwelling high art snobs criticizing Bob Ross and just looking down on him for making mass-produced art that isn't real art and then being successful with it and being happiness to a lot of people, his life was utterly devoid of scandals. He just liked his animals and his friends and his painting and his privacy. It's just really unfair and a massive bummer, as the people say in the States, what happened to him. I'm sure that if he was still alive today, he would still be an amazing person that brings inspiration to a lot of people. Though considering that particular year, Bob Ross would probably have died in 2016. Seriously, fuck 2016. But even in death, he is sort of still exactly that. He has a huge impact on modern culture. He is a huge wholesome meme, probably the biggest wholesome meme if you do not account for just literally the concept of puppies. Everyone knows about happy little clouds and happy little trees, and everybody loves it. He had a certain return to fame, especially among younger generations, when in 2015, on his birthday, Twitch launched Twitch Creative, and they did so by doing a marathon of all the Joy of Painting episodes. It was a huge success. It is one of the most watched Twitch events of all time. It raked in huge amounts of cash in donations and ad revenue, much of which was donated to various charities. People loved it so much that every Monday on the Bob Ross channel on Twitch, one season of The Joy of Painting is played in its entirety. As of when this video comes out, it should be on right now. You could go to Twitch right now, search for Bob Ross and watch The Joy of Painting with a lot of people in the chat. I was in there yesterday, it had like 3,500 viewers. Also, Smite, which I think is a MOBA game, has a Bob Ross skin for one of its characters, and it looks like this. I don't know why, but I sort of appreciate it. Well, folks, that is Bob Ross. I really wish I could tell you more about him, but apparently a Spanish monk who lived on the Californian frontier in the 18th century has a lot more information about his personal life out there than Bob Ross. Thank you very much for watching this video. Do all the things that you would do with the video. This was I missed Wednesday because the internet was out. Internet is still out. I'm supposed to get my router in the mail today. Not sure that it's going to happen. Yeah, so in that spirit,
from all of us here, I'd like to wish you happy painting.
And see you around, cunts.